Good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you. My name is Carrie Penfat. I'm an associate professor here at the University of Miami School of Architecture and principal of Gurian Penfat Architecture based here in Miami and in Guatemala City. I will be moderating this first panel this morning, and the panel will highlight Miami and Medellin, comparing how these two cities are striving to be smart, resilient cities. The way we will, I would like to just briefly introduce our panel today, beginning with Matt Anderson, who is the Assistant Director for Mobility and Sustainability for the City of Coral Gables, Natalia Castaño Cárdenas, who's the Director and Architect, Project Leader at Urban, Álvaro Martínez Fernandez, who's the Regional Vice President of Structural Engineering at Double C, Giancarlo Massanti, who is the Director of El Equipo Massanti, Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk, who is currently the Malcolm Matheson Distinguished Professor of Architecture and Director of the Masters of Urban Design program here at the University of Miami, and also Principal of DPZ Co. And then finally, Galen Truer, who's the Head of Climate, Tech, and Economic Innovation. So we have fabulous guests in a very short amount of time to cover a lot of ground. So what we're going to do is we will begin with Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk, who will give a short presentation on Miami, followed by Natalia and Giancarlo, that will be speaking to Medellin, followed by a short discussion by the panel. So Liz, I turn the floor to you. Thank you, Carrie. Just to add to the prior discussion, among my new urbanist colleagues, it's been pointed out that changing the urban fabric, which we are all working on intensely in the U.S., will take at least a generation, and the electrical vehicle, in the meantime, offers a technological approach to reducing our impact on the environment while we change our behavior in the long run. So I will be giving you a short description of the evolving response to climate change and resilience in South Florida. It's going to be very basic. I assume not everyone is conversant with the climate change jargon, so I'm going to give you some of the basics on that, and hopefully point out that this is a very complex issue or concern that needs a systematic approach, and how at least one person is approaching it. I teach a course on adaptation to climate change. So to begin with, we speak of responses, not solutions. Although you hear the word solutions often used in trying to address climate change, it's important to understand we can make responses. We're not going to solve it. Reducing the source of the problem, or changing the source of the problem, is what we call mitigation. The sustainability efforts of many decades already fall into that category. Adaptation to the impacts to what is occurring as a result of climate change is what we would call resilience. And the responses, as we've already heard, are both technology and behavior in terms of mitigation or affecting the source. Adaptation is a little bit more complex. There's a series of steps, sometimes sequential, sometimes back and forth, from fortifying and defending, accommodating, this is difficult to see, retreating, and finally cleaning up. And in advance, I will apologize. I've made a lot of lists because sometimes these presentations are useful reference afterwards. In our part of Florida, Miami's part of a small region, our work on resilience has begun with the hazards that we first experienced when the city's first growth was booming in 1926, and it was arrested by the first large hurricane. So that sequence of experiences means we've been dealing with resilience in many ways
trying to reduce the impacts of weather in particular, not necessarily climate, for many, many decades. Multiple agencies work on it. This hazard mitigation program was begun after Hurricane Andrew, which was kind of the big wake-up call in '92, when we really seriously started working on it and imagining how our future must change because of that. Out of that hazard approach grew an approach to sustainability, and the county developed in 2010 a greenprint, which was a series of goals laid out, including the very last one, respond to climate change. And at that time, it was considered an approach to reducing emissions. No one was talking about adaptation yet. However, by 2009, one of our leaders, Harvey Rubin, brought our attention to adaptation. The Climate Change Action Task Force, of which I was lucky to be part of, started to address how we need to adapt to inevitable change. And a series of steps have taken place since then. The Climate Compact, which is a four-county group which coordinates efforts, down to the naming of a Chief Resilience Officer, a Chief Heat Officer, and a number of different plans which are emerging. Resilient 305 is one of them. I could have spent 40 minutes just listing and showing you all the different plans. It is a complex kind of network of efforts, but they are being put out very specifically and benchmarked along the way. Now, it's important to understand that one of our major, there are many impacts here, heat as well as one of them, but sea level rise is the one that we're most concerned about. And it has many different effects, not just coming in from the ocean. And so it's important to understand where you are in the geography. This transect we drew in my course at the university has been taken on by the county in its adaptation action plans, which introduces the idea that the impacts are different, and therefore the responses need to be different depending on where you are in this geography between the Everglades and the ocean. It's also important to understand that there are two different kinds of responses, or two different kinds of effects or impacts that we need to think about responding to. And one is catastrophic, that's the hurricane usually in our case, wind and flooding. And the other one is the chronic impacts. We have something we call sunny day flooding, which is actually water rising through the ground that needs to be addressed in a kind of permanent way, not just bouncing back. So, part of that is imagining how do all these parts come together. This is a diagram that I made to start thinking about it, and it's intended to say, okay, so there are between the chronic and the catastrophic, there are both public and private concerns or responsibilities, the public utilities and rights of way, the private property. And each one of them has to contend with, defend, accommodate, retreat, and clean up in terms of thinking ahead and how do we do that. So a lot of that is really, in fact, underway. The first actions are taking place for defend and fortify. In Miami Beach at Purdy Avenue, you can see this raising of a street, almost 3 feet. That's the old sidewalk level down below where the restaurant umbrellas are. And the scale of the technology, the pumps that keep the water from staying in those lower areas and keep moving it out to the bay is really quite intense. At the same time, so that was a chronic issue of flooding which is being dealt with. There are proposals for to protect us from the catastrophic storm surge of hurricanes. The Army Corps of Engineers came up with a wall when first publication of it came out in the Herald. Somebody on the staff threw graffiti on it, which later disappeared from the photos. But we are continuing with other approaches which may have natural components and not be quite as extreme as that first one, including this newer proposal for a piece of coastline in Miami, which you can begin to see is thinking a little bit more in terms of quality of life and the human experience while protection is underway. So, but in the long term, and I think the latest IPCC report really did bring our attention to this, there are places because of climate impact we will not be able to stay. Certainly not everywhere, but this is one where we might start thinking about how to get out of harm's way, which is the one universal adaptation. It's already occurring with property buyouts in the Keys. There are other areas along Long Island where some of this kind of managed retreat is being practiced. And this is where the public and private sector distinctions become important, because the public sector is in it for the long term. They're providing the services for any kind of inhabitation, and the reaction to what those responsibilities are is a huge investment. We can't imagine raising all of the streets, but we are already beginning to just raise some of the bridges, as you see in this Venetian Causeway article. In the private sector, it becomes even more complicated because there are many different, this is what I call a question mark about the end of real estate, because everyone in the private sector who owns a property imagines that it will have a continuing value or, in fact, increase in value. And so how that is managed becomes something that really does require a lot of thought about it. Is it short-term, long-term? Do we have to invent some kind of financial smoke and mirrors to make it happen? So we know from our experience with Rust Belt cities what the unmanaged trajectory would be like. That we're experiencing an interruption in that with all the new arrivals in town who seem to be ignoring our climate future. But we will have to be setting the priorities for this kind of management of our future in a way that we've never had to before. And so one of the things that I would look forward to is a way to collaborate with others, and maybe technology could help us do this, to study the scenarios over different time frames, different locations, geography, what the political process might be like, how do we coordinate the agencies, what's the new kind of financing that we need for real estate. Maybe it's more like an automobile in which we know it's going to decrease in value, but we're going to enjoy its use in the meantime.